Slow motion is a great technique to add drama to your video or to emphasize the action that's happening. Today, I will give you 5 tips to make your slow motion look awesome. Though many of your smartphones have the ability to do slow motion video, if you use your DSLR or mirrorless camera, often the quality will look much better. I want to talk a little bit about the traditional frame rate of video and then how to set your camera to optimize the quality. Traditionally, film is shot at 24 frames a second or sometimes 30 frames a second. Now, when you shoot slow motion video, you often have the ability to shoot 60 frames, 120, and some cameras can even do 240 frames a second. And by having more frames and then slowing it down to the traditional frame rate of 24 or 30 frames a second, you're able to create the illusion of slow motion video. Today we're going to choose the fastest frame rate that your camera has. In this case, my camera has 120 frames a second at HD quality, so that's what I'm going to use. Often, when you use faster frame rates with your camera, the resolution decreases because the camera is trying to capture all that information at a pretty quick speed. So today I'm going to set my camera at its fastest frame rate, which is 120 frames per second, and that's going to be at HD 1920 by 1080 resolution. Tip 1. You're going to want to use a fast shutter speed to be able to freeze the action in every frame. If your shutter speed is a little too slow for the speed of the action, you'll wind up with blurred frames and your slow motion won't look as crisp. I set my camera at 120 frames per second, and I'm going to film my daughter running through a field today. And so I'm going to set my shutter speed at 1,000th of a second. That's roughly 8 times the frame rate. So 120 frames a second at 1,000th of a second shutter speed. And I'm going to have my camera set in manual mode, just so you're aware. So I'm setting the shutter at 1,000th of a second. I'm using the Tamron 35 f 1.4 lens today, and I have it wide open at 1.4 at about 200 ISO. With less blur in the image, you can also use software later to slow your frame rate down even more. Tip 2. Many modern cameras allow you the ability to have automatic focus tracking when you're shooting video. So if your camera has that, sometimes it's referred to as continuous focus or full-time autofocus. I would engage that because especially when you're shooting at wide open apertures and you have movement, it's almost impossible to be able to manually focus while shooting this type of action. Tip 3. When you're out shooting your action, consider a couple of things. First of all, in general, when you're closer to the movement that's happening, the imagery is going to look more dynamic. So if you're too far away, you really won't get the full effect of the motion that's happening that you're going to slow down. Tip 4. Once you have the footage downloaded to your computer or external hard drive, you're going to need a computer program in order to be able to take full advantage of the slow motion footage you just shot. For this example, I'm going to be using Adobe Premiere. When you create a timeline in a program like Premiere, you're going to set the frames per second for the sequence, and this will affect how the footage is interpreted and played back. In this case, I'm going to choose 24 frames a second in my timeline at 1920 by 1080 resolution, which is the resolution that my camera shoots slow motion footage. If I were to just drag my footage in the timeline, you can see that it plays back in real time. So we need to change the way the program interprets the footage. Though there are several ways to do this, one of the easiest is to select the footage and then Control-click and choose Interpret Footage. Then tell the computer to assume the frame rate which matches the frame rate of the timeline. So in this case, 24 frames a second, which is at drop frame 23.976. By telling the computer to assume the frame rate which matches the frame of the timeline, now when you put the footage in the timeline, it plays in slow motion. Tip 5. If you want the footage to play even slower than the frame rate that you shot, you can ask the software to interpolate the footage. Select the footage in the timeline, control-click, and change its speed. In this case, I wouldn't go any slower than 50%. There are 3 different ways that the footage can be interpreted, and in this case, I think I'm going to choose optical flow. So essentially, I'm making 120 frames a second, 240 frames a second. Then I go in and select the parts of the clips that I like and put it together to make a short little film. Now, all you have to do is export the footage from the timeline, and there you go. Amazing, dynamic, slow-motion footage to wow your friends, neighbors, or clients. Let's take a look at our finished slow-motion film.
Hold fast to dreams. For if dreams die, life is a broken winged bird that cannot fly. Hold fast to dreams. For when dreams go, life is a barren field, frozen with snow. Hold fast to dreams.
Thanks for watching.